When I first stumbled upon the old lake, it wasn't much more than a forgotten depression in the earth, half swallowed by cattails and mud. The locals called it Clover Sink because it hadn't held more than a few inches of water in decades, and the previous owner had long stopped maintaining the property. But the first time I walked its perimeter on a cool autumn afternoon, something inside me clicked. The air was heavy with that sweet smell of decaying leaves, and the reflection of the golden trees in the shallow water made it look like a broken mirror trying to remember what it once was. I knew, right then and there, I wanted to bring it back to life. I wasn't thinking about profit or property value, I just wanted to restore something that time and neglect had stolen. After years of working construction, saving every dime, and avoiding unnecessary luxuries, I finally had enough money to buy something meaningful. That lake, or what was left of it, became my dream project. The land came with a little over 15 acres, mostly wooded with a narrow dirt road cutting through the trees. There was a worn-down shack near the edge, the kind of place that might have been used for fishing or storing gear back when the lake still mattered. I bought the entire parcel at an auction, surprising even the realtor when I outbid a couple of local developers who had their eyes on it for potential subdivision. I didn't tell anyone what I planned to do. I just signed the papers, paid the fees, and stood in that clearing with the deed in my hand, feeling a kind of satisfaction I hadn't known before. For the first time in years, I wasn't working on someone else's project, I was building my own. The first few weeks were backbreaking. The lake bed was overgrown with reeds, littered with trash, and clogged with decades of silt. I rented an excavator, bought waders, and spent long days dredging and hauling debris. Old tires, rusted metal, and even a sunken rowboat came out of that muck. Every shovel of dirt I moved revealed something else, a layer of history, an artifact of neglect. By the time winter rolled around, I had shaped the basin properly again, cleared the banks, and restored the natural inflow from the nearby creek that had been blocked by fallen trees and silt buildup. I wasn't doing all this alone, though. My neighbor, Earl, a retired park ranger, saw what I was doing and wandered over one morning with a cup of coffee in hand and a grin that said he'd been waiting for someone crazy enough to try this. He offered to help, and I gladly accepted. We spent weeks laying down erosion mats, planting native grasses, and reinforcing the edges with river rock. It wasn't glamorous work, but every time I watched the waterline rise a little higher, every time I saw a frog hop back into the reeds or a bird land where there hadn't been one before, I felt something close to pride. By early spring, the lake was alive again. The water shimmered, the air buzzed with dragonflies, and the reflection of the morning sun danced across the surface like something out of a painting. I even built a small dock, nothing fancy, just a few treated boards and posts, but it was mine. I'd go down there every evening with a folding chair, a cold drink, and just sit, watching the water catch the last light. Sometimes Earl joined me, and we'd talk about the old days, or just sit in silence listening to the frogs. It was peace, the kind I hadn't known since childhood. Then, one morning in May, I found a white SUV parked by the dirt road leading into my property. A woman was standing beside it, wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a clipboard. She looked like the kind of person who believed clipboards granted authority. I'd seen her type before, pristine manicure, spotless sneakers, an aura of control that made the air feel tense. She introduced herself as Karen, the acting president of the nearby Lakeside Homeowners Association. I told her I didn't live in Lakeside. She smiled, a tight little curve that never reached her eyes, and said, "Oh, I'm aware. But your property borders our community, and this lake, well, it's part of our shared ecosystem. We have concerns." I remember laughing softly, not out of disrespect but disbelief. Concerns? Lady, this lake was a puddle before I got here. It wasn't on anyone's radar until now. She didn't laugh. She started explaining something about community water rights and HOA oversight, as if her clipboard could rewrite property lines. When I asked her to show me any document proving her claim, she fumbled, muttered something about pending adjustments, and left, saying she'd be in touch. I didn't think much of it at first. Every project attracts busybodies, but something about her tone stuck with me. It wasn't curiosity, it was entitlement. Over the next few weeks, Karen's appearances became more frequent. Sometimes she'd park by the road and take photos, pretending not to see me. Once, she brought 2 other people, one man in a polo shirt with an HOA badge pinned to his chest, and another carrying what looked like a drone. They hovered it over the lake, filming. When I approached them, they said they were documenting environmental impact. I told them to leave my property immediately or I'd call the sheriff. They left, but not before Karen warned, "You'll regret being difficult." The HOA takes these matters seriously. I brushed it off, thinking she was just another bored suburban dictator with too much time. But then the letters started coming. Official-looking envelopes marked with the Lakeside HOA seal, demanding that I cease unauthorized construction and submit environmental restoration plans for approval. I laughed the first time. The second, I ignored it. The third came with a threat of legal action. That's when I called my lawyer friend, Pete, who used to handle land disputes for the county. After looking over my deed and the letters, he chuckled. "They don't have a leg to stand on," he said. "Your property line is well outside their jurisdiction. Ignore them. If they trespass, call the cops." For a while, things quieted down. I focused on finishing the landscaping, even stocked the lake with fish, bass, bluegill, and catfish. I built a small boathouse and put up a wooden sign at the entrance, "Clover Lake, private property." It felt official, like the final step in reclaiming the place's dignity. But peace never lasts when people like Karen are involved. It was a Saturday morning when I heard the sirens. Not the distant kind that fade down the highway, but close, right at my gate. 2 black SUVs with flashing lights pulled up, and 4 men in tactical vests stepped out. The letters, "Police," were taped across their backs in what looked like duct tape. One of them barked, "Sir, step away from the property. This is an active investigation." I froze for a second, trying to process what I was seeing. Their uniforms looked off, no county insignia, no badge numbers. Their vests were mismatched, and one guy was wearing sneakers. My gut clenched. Something was wrong. I asked for their credentials, but the one in front snapped, "Don't make this difficult. We've had reports of illegal water diversion and environmental damage." That's when I saw Karen's white SUV parked just behind them. She stood there, arms crossed, wearing that same smug smile. I knew instantly what was happening. I didn't argue. I pulled out my phone, started recording, and called the real sheriff's office. Within 20 minutes, 2 legitimate deputies showed up. The moment they arrived, the officers started getting nervous. The deputies asked for IDs, and that's when everything unraveled. The so-called cops weren't cops at all. They were HOA security contractors, hired by Karen to enforce compliance. They didn't have badges, warrants, or authority. The deputies made them hand over their fake IDs and ordered them off my property. Karen tried to argue, saying she was authorized under community code, but the deputies cut her off. That was the first time I saw her facade crack. Her lips trembled, her voice quivered, and she stammered, "You'll be hearing from our legal department." I remember smiling and saying, "Can't wait." That day was the beginning of something much bigger, something I hadn't realized was only just starting to unfold. Karen's little stunt with the fake cops was just the first move in what would become the nastiest HOA war the county had ever seen. And I wasn't backing down. After the fake cop incident, things escalated fast. News traveled quickly in small towns, and by Monday morning, half the neighborhood had heard about the guy who called real cops on the HOA. Some folks found it hilarious, others didn't. I started noticing cars slowing down near my gate, people pointing, phones out. I wasn't looking for fame, but apparently, I'd become the star of a local suburban drama. Karen and her cronies weren't about to let me have the last word, though. Within a week, they filed a formal complaint with the county environmental office, claiming that my unauthorized excavation and artificial water control posed a danger to local wildlife and the community ecosystem. I almost laughed when the letter came, but then I saw the list of agencies they'd CC'd: the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Natural Resources, and even the state's Department of Water Management. It was a smear campaign disguised as bureaucracy. Pete, my lawyer, called it paper terrorism, a trick HOAs use to bury you under false reports and red tape until you either quit or give in. But I wasn't quitting. Pete and I filed counterclaims and provided documentation, permits, land surveys, restoration plans, photos from start to finish. The county inspector came out, took one look, and shook his head. "You've done more restoration work here than the city's done in a decade," he said, snapping pictures of the thriving lake. "If anything, this should be a model project." He wrote his report on site, clearing me of all allegations. When I asked if he'd had complaints from the HOA before, he smirked. "Oh yeah. This isn't their first rodeo. They like control. You're just the first person who's fought back properly." That night, I celebrated by the dock with a beer in hand and my dog, Max, lying at my feet. Fireflies flickered across the reeds, the lake mirrored the stars, and everything felt perfect again, for about 3 days. Then Karen's next move hit. This time, it wasn't letters or fake cops. It was trespassers. One afternoon, I came home to find a group of men clearing brush near my lake's eastern bank. They wore reflective vests with the HOA logo printed across the back. When I asked what they were doing, one of them said they were surveying land for community access. I laughed outright. Community access to my lake? Try again. I called the sheriff, and the same deputy from before showed up, Deputy Harris, a solid guy who didn't take crap from anyone. He asked them for written authorization. Of course, they had none. Karen soon arrived, heels sinking into the dirt, waving her phone like a weapon. "This area has been part of our shared use map since 1992, she barked. Harris looked at me, then at her, and calmly asked to see proof. She couldn't provide a single document. When he told her and her crew to leave or face trespassing charges, she lost it, her face turned red, voice shrill, eyes wild. "You can't talk to me like that. I pay your salary," she screamed. Harris deadpanned, "Ma'am, I'm county law enforcement. You pay property taxes, not my paycheck. Please step off private property." I wish I'd filmed it. Karen stormed off, muttering curses and threats. But that wasn't the end. Later that night, someone threw a handful of nails across my driveway. Max barked non-stop. The next morning, I found tire tracks along the side of the lake and cigarette butts near the boathouse. I installed trail cameras that afternoon, high-res, motion-activated, and hidden in plain sight. It was only a matter of days before I caught exactly what I suspected. The footage showed Karen's husband, Rick, sneaking onto my land after dark, flashlight in hand. He walked the shoreline, taking pictures and measuring something with a tape. The next night, he came back, this time, tossing what looked like a plastic bag into the water. The following morning, my lake had an oily sheen on part of its surface. I called the sheriff again, filed a report, and handed over the footage. That was the moment everything flipped. See, when the sheriff's department tested the water, they found traces of motor oil and fertilizer, enough to trigger an environmental violation if they could prove intent. And thanks to my cameras, intent was clear as day. Rick was caught red-handed contaminating a body of water that wasn't even theirs. The county took it seriously. Within a week, Rick was served with an environmental contamination citation, and Karen's precious HOA faced a civil investigation for harassment and property interference. But Karen didn't go down quietly. She showed up at my gate again, this time shaking with anger. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she spat, her voice cracking. "You're ruining our community's reputation." I stayed calm. "No, Karen. You're doing that all by yourself." She tried to storm onto my property, but I warned her that the sheriff's office had officially declared my land off-limits to all HOA members pending investigation. She froze, realizing that for once, the law wasn't bending her way. The look in her eyes told me she wasn't finished, but she was running out of moves. Or so I thought. A few weeks passed quietly. Summer rolled in, the lake reached its full depth, and I started getting visitors, not from the HOA, but from locals who wanted to see the miracle lake. Word spread online. A local environmental blogger even did a short video calling it one man's restoration triumph. It felt surreal. I hadn't set out to make a statement, but people started seeing the lake as something bigger, a symbol of taking back what belongs to the individual, not to bureaucracies. Then came the cease and desist order. A thick envelope arrived, this time from a law firm representing the HOA. They claimed that, due to historical community use and long-standing easement rights, the lake was technically shared property. They demanded that I grant full access to lakeside residents for recreational and community purposes. Pete almost fell out of his chair laughing when I showed him. "This is ridiculous," he said, wiping tears from his eyes. "They're trying to use adverse possession logic for a lake they never owned." He drafted a formal rebuttal, citing the original land surveys, title history, and even the HOA's founding charter, which clearly stated their boundary ended half a mile from my property line. We sent that response, certified mail, and copied the county registrar. That should have ended it. But when narcissists lose control, they get desperate. A few days later, I found a brand new, community property, no trespassing, sign posted at the end of my driveway, with the HOA's logo. I tore it down immediately and installed motion lights and more cameras. But it didn't stop. Every week, new signs appeared. One night, someone dumped a pile of trash at the gate, including a note that read, "This lake belongs to us." Pete started talking about a restraining order. But I wanted to end this once and for all. I decided to go bigger, to expose everything publicly. I reached out to a local reporter who covered community disputes, a guy named Derek Jensen. I showed him everything, the fake cops, the letters, the contamination footage, the bogus signs. He was hooked. Within a week, his piece went live under the headline, HOA harasses local man over privately owned lake, fake cops, environmental sabotage, and community chaos. The story blew up. It hit every local news channel, then regional outlets. The HOA's phones were flooded with angry calls, their Facebook page was overrun with comments demanding Karen's resignation, and residents started questioning where their HOA dues were going. Karen tried to hold an emergency, community meeting to do damage control, but it backfired spectacularly. Someone recorded her yelling at residents, blaming online misinformation and outsiders, only for a man in the back to shout, "Lady, you're the outsider." The video went viral. For the first time, Karen's empire started crumbling. Her allies distanced themselves, and her husband's environmental charges went to court. The HOA's board called for a vote of no confidence, but Karen refused to step down. Instead, she tried one last Hail Mary. She filed a lawsuit against me, claiming psychological damages, property devaluation, and defamation. Pete grinned when he read it. "This is great," he said. "Now we get discovery." And discovery was where everything unraveled. Emails. Photos. Meeting minutes. All of it came spilling out, proof that Karen had orchestrated every harassment attempt, authorized the fake security detail, and even directed funds from the HOA budget to private enforcement initiatives. The HOA's own treasurer turned against her, handing over the financial records that showed she'd used community money to pay those fake cops. By the time the judge saw it, Karen's case didn't just fall apart, it exploded. The judge dismissed her lawsuit with prejudice, citing abuse of process and frivolous litigation. Then, in a move that shocked everyone, the county attorney opened an investigation into fraudulent impersonation of law enforcement, misuse of funds, and environmental violation collusion. Karen's smugness was gone. When I saw her outside the courthouse that day, she looked pale, tired, and broken. She didn't meet my eyes. She just muttered something to her lawyer and got into her SUV, driving off without another word. I wish that had been the end. But the real twist, the one that changed everything, was still coming. After the court hearing, I thought the storm had finally passed. The fake cops were exposed, the HOA's reputation was in ruins, and Karen was facing criminal investigations that could cost her everything. For the first time in almost a year, peace returned to Clover Lake. The water sparkled under the summer sun, fish jumped near the dock, and the hum of cicadas filled the air. I even caught myself smiling again, really smiling, something I hadn't done since the day the fake officers showed up. But peace, as I was learning, doesn't last long when pride and power are at stake. A month after the court victory, I started noticing something strange. County records showed that several small parcels of land near my property, thin strips of wooded buffer zones that nobody had ever cared about, were being purchased quietly, one after another. The buyer? Lakeside Community Association LLC. Karen's HOA had gone corporate. It didn't take long for me to realize what she was doing. By buying the narrow strips of land that bordered my property, she was trying to box me in legally, to create a boundary network she could later claim as shared access. I called Pete right away. He sighed, almost laughing. "Man, that woman's persistence is pathological. Don't worry. It won't work without an easement. She can buy all the trees she wants, it still doesn't give her rights to your lake." Still, I didn't like the feeling of being surrounded. I'd bought my land to get away from people like her, not to live in a constant chess match. So I did what any construction guy with a stubborn streak would do, I went on offense. I hired a surveyor, repainted my boundary markers, and installed a privacy fence along the western side where the HOA's new parcels touched mine. It wasn't just a fence, it was a statement. The day it went up, Karen appeared again. Same SUV, same sunglasses, same attitude, but now, she looked thinner, more desperate, like someone whose empire was cracking around her. She rolled down her window and sneered, "You're just making it worse for yourself." I smiled, leaning on the fence post. Funny, I thought fences make things better for everyone. Her expression hardened. "You'll see. You think you've won, but this isn't over." Then she sped off, kicking up gravel behind her tires. I didn't take her seriously at first. But 2 nights later, someone cut through a section of my new fence. It wasn't random vandalism, the cut was clean, deliberate. My trail cams picked up 2 figures in hoodies, both wearing gloves. They moved fast and avoided the camera's direct line of sight, but one made a mistake. He looked up at the wrong time, and the camera caught part of his face. It was Rick, her husband. Again. I filed another report, this time pushing for criminal charges. The sheriff's office was patient but firm. They'd already dealt with Karen's nonsense for months. When they came to arrest Rick for trespassing and vandalism, Karen arrived mid-arrest, screaming that they had no authority and threatening to call her lawyer. It didn't work. Rick was booked and released on bail, but now both of them were under the legal microscope. That's when things got weird. Late one evening, around dusk, I was down by the dock with Max when I noticed headlights in the distance. Not unusual, there was a small county road that passed nearby, but these lights weren't moving. They were parked, aimed directly at the lake. I watched for a while, uneasy, then went inside. 10 minutes later, I heard splashing. I grabbed my flashlight, ran down, and caught sight of something, or someone, in the water near the far edge of the lake. They were tossing something heavy into it. By the time I got there, the person was gone, and my truck's headlights illuminated floating debris, black trash bags tied shut. My stomach dropped. I called Harris, the deputy, who came out immediately. They pulled the bags out, and when they opened them, I couldn't believe what I saw: old rebar, chunks of cement, and rusted metal. Someone was dumping debris into my newly restored lake. We spent hours collecting evidence, taking photos, documenting tire tracks. Harris told me, whoever's doing this isn't just trying to harass you, they're trying to ruin the lake again. Make it look polluted. And that's exactly what happened. Over the next week, more trash appeared, cans, scrap, even old appliances. Whoever it was had access to heavy equipment. That's when it hit me, the HOA maintenance team. They had storage facilities nearby with trucks and tools. Pete suggested something bold, installing a hidden wildlife camera drone system that could capture wide-angle footage across the property at night. So I did. I invested in a set of silent, motion-triggered drones that hovered for brief bursts when movement was detected. Within a few days, I caught them. The footage showed 2 HOA maintenance trucks pulling up to the edge of the woods at midnight. The men got out and started unloading debris straight into the lake. Clear as day. And guess who was standing next to them, directing with a flashlight? Karen herself. When we turned that footage over to the sheriff and the county prosecutor, everything changed. This wasn't just trespassing or vandalism anymore. It was felony-level environmental destruction and criminal conspiracy. The county opened a full investigation. Warrants were issued for the HOA's equipment yard and financial records. They found receipts, signed by Karen, for the materials used in the dumping, disguised under maintenance expenses. She'd been funneling HOA funds to pay workers for what she called community restoration, but really it was a sabotage campaign. When the news broke, it spread like wildfire. The same reporter, Derek Jensen, did a follow-up piece titled, HOA President Accused of Environmental Sabotage, Lake War Escalates. Karen was arrested the next day. The footage went viral, and even the state's attorney general took notice. She faced charges of felony property destruction, illegal dumping, impersonation of law enforcement, and fraudulent use of HOA funds. Rick was charged as an accessory. I thought that would be the end of her story. But when the human ego gets cornered, it doesn't fade quietly, it explodes. While Karen awaited trial, the HOA's remaining board tried to distance themselves from her, but they were in too deep. Homeowners started demanding refunds, lawsuits piled up, and the HOA's insurance company dropped them. Within 3 months, Lakeside Community Association LLC declared bankruptcy. Their remaining assets, including the little buffer parcels they'd bought near my property, went up for auction. And I bought them. Every single acre. When I closed the deal, I remember standing on the now expanded property line, looking over Clover Lake with the deed in my hand and a smile that felt like victory itself. The HOA that had tried to claim my lake now legally owned nothing, and I owned the very ground they'd stood on. Earl, my neighbor, laughed so hard when I told him. "You bought the battlefield, son," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Now nobody can come near it again." For a while, life returned to normal. The county even honored me for environmental restoration efforts. I built a new sign at the entrance that read, "Clover Lake Nature Reserve, private property, public respect." It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about pride, peace, and proof that one person can stand up to corruption and win. But fate had one more twist in store. A few weeks after Karen's sentencing, she pled guilty to avoid a trial. I got a letter. No return address, no signature, just a plain envelope with my name on it. Inside was a handwritten note, "You think you own everything now. But that lake isn't what you think it is. Check your deeds, 3rd page, line 7. You missed something." At first, I thought it was a prank. But curiosity got the better of me. I pulled out the deed, flipped to the 3rd page, and there it was, small print referencing historic waterway rights retained by the state from the early 1900s. It wasn't ownership, it was an easement clause, allowing for public utility access if the lake ever reconnected to the old county reservoir system upstream. My stomach turned cold. The clause was ancient, probably forgotten by everyone, but technically, it meant the state, not the HOA, had potential jurisdiction over parts of the waterway if they ever deemed it navigable. And that's when the twist hit me. What if Karen had known? What if that's what she'd been hinting at all along, not that the HOA owned it, but that they wanted to use that clause to push for state recognition, and then grab control through community partnership? I sat there for a long time, staring at the reflection of the lake in my office window, thinking about everything that had happened. The battles, the lies, the fake cops, the sabotage, it had all started because I wanted to bring something dead back to life. And somehow, that act of restoration had exposed the rot in an entire community. But as I watched the water glimmer under the evening sky, I realized something. No matter what hidden clauses or bureaucratic relics existed, that lake was mine in every way that mattered. I had restored it, defended it, and turned it into something worth fighting for. And if anyone ever tried to take it again, be it Karen, the HOA, or even the state, they'd be facing someone who'd already beaten them once. And this time, I'd be ready. For a few nights after that letter arrived, sleep wouldn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that single line of legal print glowing in my mind, historic waterway rights reserved by the state. I'd read enough deeds over the years to know that one stray phrase could be a loaded gun, waiting for the right hand to pull the trigger. I kept the note in my desk drawer, staring at it every morning like it might start speaking. Who had sent it? Karen was under sentencing restrictions, she couldn't contact me directly. Rick was on probation and avoiding any public attention. The HOA was gone. That left only one possibility, someone from inside the county records office or a lawyer who'd been following the story. Someone who wanted me to find this detail but didn't want their name attached. Curiosity turned into obsession. I spent 3 full days in the courthouse archives, flipping through brittle folders and microfilm reels that smelled like dust and ink. Clover Lake's history went back more than a century. Long before suburban development, the lake had been part of a chain of natural reservoirs feeding into the main river system. In 1911, the state had surveyed it for potential irrigation use. The project was abandoned a year later, but the legal designation remained. Technically, Clover Lake was still listed as a potentially navigable body of water, even though it had been bone dry for decades until I restored it. That single clause, if pushed the wrong way, could allow the state, or anyone petitioning as a public stakeholder, to claim oversight. Meaning the HOA, in theory, might have tried to use it to justify their control. The more I learned, the more I realized Karen's insanity hadn't been as random as I'd thought. She hadn't just been grasping for power, she'd been chasing a legal loophole. But knowledge cuts both ways. If that clause existed, then I could use it too. I drove to Pete's office with a folder full of copies and notes. He skimmed the papers, frowning. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "She wasn't totally crazy. But you're right, if anyone files a petition to reopen the waterway classification, the state could reassert control." My stomach sank. "So, what do I do? Drain it again?" Pete grinned slowly. "No. You do the opposite. You make it official, before anyone else can. You register the lake as a private conservation reserve under your name. If the state recognizes it as protected land managed by an individual, that old clause becomes irrelevant. You'll own the rights through stewardship." That one sentence changed everything. For the next month, I worked like a man possessed. Between Pete's filings and my own legwork, I drafted a full environmental restoration plan, complete with species inventory, water quality records, drone footage, and soil studies. I gathered every bit of evidence showing how Clover Lake had been a wasteland before I bought it and how it now thrived as a natural habitat. The plan ran over 200 pages. I sent it to the State Department of Environmental Resources with an application to designate Clover Lake as a certified private nature reserve, something only a handful of people in the state had ever done. While waiting, I poured myself back into the land. The place had become more than a project, it was part of my identity. I planted oak saplings along the north bank, built a small observation deck with solar lights, and even installed nesting boxes for swallows. Earl came by every few days, leaning on his walking stick and shaking his head. "You're building a paradise, kid. Just make sure no one else claims the Garden of Eden again." He wasn't wrong. About 6 weeks later, I received a thick envelope with the state seal. My hands actually trembled as I opened it. The letter began with the words, "Congratulations, Mr. Anderson. After review and on recommendation from the department's regional office, your application has been approved. Clover Lake is hereby designated as a private conservation reserve under State Code 41B. I must have read it a dozen times before it sank in. The lake wasn't just mine, it was legally protected, with my name registered as its steward and guardian. Even the old 1911 clause couldn't override the new classification. The state had, in effect, declared me the caretaker of a living ecosystem. I celebrated the only way that felt right, sitting on the dock at sunset, Max beside me, watching the ripples spread across the water like they were breathing. For the first time in months, I felt free. But freedom, I was learning, always attracts envy. 2 days later, Derek Jensen, the reporter who'd followed the whole saga, called me. "Hey, congratulations," he said, excitement crackling in his voice. "I saw the designation filing on the state register. That's huge. But, you might want to see something." He sent me a link to an online post, a freshly created forum thread titled "The Truth About Clover Lake." The author claimed I'd illegally privatized a public waterway, and attached distorted snippets of old survey maps and out-of-context quotes from my filings. The account's username? Lakeside Truth. I stared at the screen, jaw tightening. I didn't need a DNA test to know whose fingerprints were behind it. Even from the ashes of her empire, Karen was still trying to twist the story. I ignored it at first, but then the comments started piling up, angry locals accusing me of stealing public land, threatening to protest, demanding access to their lake. A local TV station picked up the story, giving airtime to an anonymous caller who claimed to be a former Lakeside HOA representative. She didn't name herself, but the cadence of her voice was unmistakable. "Karen." Pete urged me to stay calm. "She's just trying to bait you," he said. "Don't engage publicly. We'll handle it legally if it gets worse." But it did get worse. Within a week, strangers began showing up at my gate again, this time not HOA members but curious residents and would-be activists. They snapped photos, flew drones overhead, even left leaflets accusing me of hoarding a natural resource. I felt the old anger boiling back up. After everything I'd endured, they were turning me into the villain. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the lake in gold, a white car rolled up to the gate. It wasn't Karen's SUV, but the woman who stepped out made my pulse skip. She looked younger, maybe mid-30s, but the resemblance was uncanny. Same sharp chin, same piercing stare. "Can I help you?" I called, keeping my voice measured. She smiled tightly. "You already have, Mr. Anderson. I'm Lydia Warren, Karen's sister." I didn't reply, waiting for whatever performance this was going to be. "She asked me to return something," Lydia said, holding up a small envelope. Before she left town. I took it carefully. Inside was a photograph, an old black and white aerial image showing Clover Lake back when it was full, with hand-drawn boundary lines and notations scrawled in the margins. At the bottom, in faded ink, a signature, "Property of Lakeside Cooperative, 1938. My breath caught. "What is this?" "She said you'd know," Lydia replied softly. She found it in the county archives years ago. She believed it proved the lake was once community-managed land. I felt a mix of anger and pity. Karen had built her crusade on ghosts. Whatever that cooperative had been, it hadn't survived the Great Depression. The deed chain after 1940 clearly showed private ownership transfers. But Karen had clung to this relic, convinced it was destiny. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked. Lydia looked toward the lake, eyes softening. "Because she's gone, Mr. Anderson. Moved out of state. She said she can't stand to see it anymore. But she wanted you to understand, she didn't start all this just out of spite. She thought she was defending her father's legacy. He helped draft that cooperative plan back then. It was supposed to be a public recreation lake before it dried up." For a moment, silence filled the space between us. The cicadas hummed, water lapped gently against the dock. I'd spent months imagining Karen as a cartoon villain, but hearing this made her human, flawed, and broken. "I'll keep the photo," I said finally. "Maybe it'll remind me what this fight was really about." Lydia nodded. That's all she wanted. She turned to leave, then paused. "You know," she said, "if you'd just talked to her differently that first day, maybe none of this would have happened." When her car disappeared down the road, I stood there holding that photograph, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Maybe she was right. Maybe pride had blinded both of us. But I also knew something she didn't. I hadn't just restored a lake. I'd reclaimed a truth, one built not on greed or power, but on effort, sweat, and respect for the land. And I wasn't about to let anyone rewrite that again. That night, I stayed on the dock long after the stars appeared, the old photograph balanced on my knees. The black and white image looked fragile, but the emotions it stirred were anything but. Maybe Karen really had believed she was protecting something. Maybe that belief, twisted by ego and loneliness, had turned her into the tyrant who'd made my life hell. Either way, her story ended where mine began. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't done, not in spirit, not in reputation. The rumors she'd planted online were spreading, and every time I saw a comment calling me a thief, something inside me clenched. I'd earned this land. I'd rebuilt it with my hands. And I was done being silent. I spent the next week gathering everything, video footage, official documents, time-lapse clips of the lake's rebirth. Then I called Derek again. "Ready to write the real story?" I asked. He laughed. "I thought you'd never ask." Together we planned a feature, not a defense piece, not an angry rant, but a chronicle of restoration. He filmed interviews with the biologist who'd verified the fish populations, the county engineer who'd confirmed my water rights, even Earl, who told his version of the early days with his trademark gruff humor. "You think he's exaggerating?" Earl told the camera, chuckling. "I saw that lake dry as bone. He brought it back. Only folks mad about it are the ones who miss bossing people around." When the segment aired 2 weeks later, it hit like a controlled explosion. The visuals were undeniable, side-by-side comparisons of the wasteland I'd bought versus the thriving sanctuary it had become. My application document scrolled across the screen, stamped and certified. The closing line read, "Sometimes the biggest fight for public good begins with one man's private effort." Within a day, the comments flipped. The same people who'd been shouting online now flooded the station's page with praise. Local teachers asked if they could bring students for environmental tours. A university biology department reached out about doing research on aquatic plant regeneration. And then, inevitably, came the letter from the State House. This time, it wasn't a threat or a bureaucratic notice. It was an invitation. The governor's environmental liaison wanted to meet and discuss expanding the private reserve program using Clover Lake as the pilot model. When I showed up at the Capitol, wearing the same weathered boots I'd used to dig the first trench, the officials looked pleasantly surprised. "You're the guy who rebuilt that lake?" one asked, shaking my hand. "We expected a corporation." "Just me," I said. "And a stubborn streak." By the end of that meeting, I'd signed a partnership memo granting the state research access while retaining full ownership. They'd handle grants and scientific oversight, I'd keep the stewardship title. It was everything the HOA had claimed to want, community benefit, without a single inch of their control. That was when I realized my revenge was complete. I hadn't needed to destroy anyone. I'd simply outlasted them, turned their weapon into my armor. Still, I had one last move in mind. Using the state's official logo, I commissioned a new sign for the entrance road, Clover Lake Conservation Reserve established by private restoration, 2025 steward, Daniel Anderson. Beneath it, in smaller letters, I added, "Former site of Lakeside HOA, dissolved." When the workers bolted it to the post, Earl whistled low. "That's gonna sting somebody if she ever drives by again." "I hope she does," I said. "Maybe she'll see what real stewardship looks like." Life settled after that. The protesters vanished, replaced by hikers and photographers who followed the posted rules and treated the place with respect. I opened a small visitor day once a month, letting families fish under supervision. The laughter of kids echoing over the water was the sweetest kind of music, the sound of peace returning. On the 1-year anniversary of the certification, Derek returned for an update. We stood by the same dock, camera rolling as the sun rose behind us. "So, Dan," he asked, "what's next?" I looked out over the gleaming surface. "Next? Maybe I'll build a trail around the East Ridge. Maybe I'll just sit here and listen to the water. Either way, this lake's got a future now." When the camera shut off, he turned serious. "You know, Karen's name came up in a follow-up search. She's living quietly in Oregon. Bought a cabin near another small lake." I smiled faintly. "Then maybe she finally found her peace too." He nodded. "Seems fitting, doesn't it?" That night, after he left, I took out the old photograph one last time. I slipped it into a frame and hung it in my study, right above the new state certificate. The black and white image and the glossy printed document looked like two halves of the same story, separated by a century of misunderstanding. Sometimes, I thought, people don't realize they're fighting for the same thing until it's too late. I stepped outside, the cool breeze carrying the scent of pine and clean water. The stars reflected off the lake, each one shimmering like a tiny promise. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, I wasn't angry or defensive. Just grateful. I'd learned that ownership isn't about a piece of paper, it's about care. And no fake cops, no self-appointed committees, no ghosts from the past could ever take that away again. Max padded up beside me, tail wagging. I ruffled his fur and sat down on the porch steps. Somewhere out on the water, a fish jumped, sending ripples that spread wider and wider until they reached the shore. "Good job, buddy," I murmured. "We did it." The night answered with quiet waves and the low call of an owl from the far trees. I leaned back, watching the sky shift from ink to silver. For a long moment, I thought of everyone who'd tried to own what they didn't understand, and everyone who'd helped me protect what mattered. Then I closed my eyes, breathing in the stillness that only comes when a fight is truly over. The lake had given me back more than land. It had given me peace. Spring returned to Clover Lake with a gentleness I hadn't felt in years. The snowmelt from the surrounding hills fed the water, turning it a deep, glassy blue that shimmered like polished stone. Birds returned in noisy flocks, nesting in the reeds I'd planted the year before. The air smelled of pine and promise. I'd just come back from town, arms full of supplies for the visitor trail project, when I noticed a dark SUV parked by the gate. My chest tightened instinctively. It wasn't the same kind of vehicle the HOA had used, but memories of those fake cops and flashing lights still made my hands clench around the steering wheel. A woman stepped out, dressed in plain clothes but with the steady confidence of someone used to being obeyed. She flashed a badge, real this time. "Mr. Anderson? I'm Investigator Hall with the State Bureau of Property and Environmental Compliance. May I have a word?" I nodded, masking my unease. "Of course. What's this about?" She looked around, eyes scanning the lake, the trail signs, the wildlife cameras. "We received an anonymous tip claiming you falsified documents during your conservation application. That you used doctored photos and forged restoration data." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind spun backward, to every document, every photo, every signature. I knew they were real. Pete had triple-checked them. But the accusation itself, that was Karen's ghost reaching from the past. I forced myself to stay calm. "You're welcome to see every file I've got," I said. "I keep copies of everything." She smiled faintly, as if expecting resistance but finding none. "I appreciate that. We'll review them here if that's all right." Inside my study, I opened the filing cabinet, handed her the thick binders of applications, inspection reports, and environmental assessments. She flipped through them carefully, making notes. I could tell she was trained to spot inconsistencies, but she wouldn't find any. Still, the accusation cut deep. After everything, after the lawsuits, the media redemption, the partnerships, someone still wanted me destroyed. Hall finally set the last file down and looked up. "Everything seems in order here," she said. "In fact, these records are cleaner than most I see." Relief washed through me, but it was short-lived. She hesitated. "There's one more thing." The anonymous report included a USB drive with video footage. "It's from one of your own wildlife cameras, timestamped just last month. You should probably see it." She plugged the drive into my laptop, opened the only file inside, and pressed play. The screen flickered, showing a night vision view of the dock. At first, nothing but wind and water. Then, movement. A figure stepped into the frame, cloaked in a long coat, holding something in their hand. They walked slowly to the edge of the dock and tossed a small object into the water. The camera autofocused, catching a glimpse of their face in the pale light. Karen. My stomach dropped. Hall froze the frame, studying it. You recognize her? Yes, I said quietly. That's Karen Warren. Former HOA president. She was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of this property. Hall nodded. That's what I thought. We'll issue a warrant for trespass and violation of a restraining order. But I barely heard her. My eyes were fixed on the part where Karen dropped something into the lake. Whatever it was, it hadn't floated, it had sunk fast, disappearing into the black water. What did she throw? I asked. Hall shook her head. No idea. But judging by the angle, it's close to your dock. Might be worth checking. After she left, I stood there for a long time, staring out the window at the calm surface of the lake. The sun was setting, turning the water to molten gold. Part of me wanted to forget it, to let it lie with everything else buried under this place's history. But another part of me, the part that couldn't leave mysteries unsolved, knew I had to find out. The next morning, I borrowed Earl's old fishing skiff and rowed out to the exact spot marked on the video. The lake was calm, mirror smooth, but I could feel a tension in the air, as if the place itself was holding its breath. I dropped a weighted hook, dragging it gently across the lake bed. For 10 minutes, nothing. Then I felt it, a faint tug, resistance, something heavy caught in the line. When I pulled it up, the water broke with a dull splash, revealing a small, corroded lockbox coated in silt and algae. The metal was rusted, but still sealed tight. I rowed back to shore, heart pounding. Inside the shed, I pried it open with a screwdriver. The lid creaked, revealing a stack of papers sealed in plastic. They were old, decades old, but still legible. At the top was a letter, handwritten in neat cursive ink. If you're reading this, then someone finally remembered what this lake was supposed to be. My name is Henry Warren. In 1938, I founded the Lakeside Cooperative to preserve Clover Lake as a shared refuge for families, not developers. We lost it during the recession, but I kept one copy of the deed, the one that proves this land was sold to private ownership with the condition that it remain protected. Below the letter was an original deed transfer form, signed by Henry Warren himself, Karen's father. It wasn't a claim of ownership. It was proof that he'd given the land up willingly, but with the hope someone would care for it the right way. I sat there staring at it, stunned. Karen hadn't been defending her father's rights, she'd been fighting his ghost, never knowing he'd already chosen peace. That realization hit me harder than any court battle ever had. She'd destroyed her life chasing a version of her father's dream that never existed. By sunset, I'd copied the documents and sealed the originals in a new waterproof case, placing it inside the cabin safe. Then I called Investigator Hall, told her what I'd found. She arranged to verify the records, confirming the authenticity through the state archive. A week later, she called back. It's real, she said. And it changes the narrative. Your property's legal history is now fully reconciled. The earliest owner intended it to be cared for, not contested. Congratulations, Mr. Anderson. You've closed a 90-year circle. When I hung up, I couldn't stop smiling. That night, I took the lockbox back out on the lake and lowered it gently into the same spot where I'd found it, this time attaching a small engraved plaque to the dock, in memory of Henry Warren, the first steward of Clover Lake Legacy Restored, 2025. It felt right. Maybe even necessary. Over the following months, life settled into a rhythm of quiet satisfaction. The state's new partnership program expanded, naming Clover Lake as the model site. Students, conservationists, and even local families visited to learn about restoration and coexistence. The community that once resented me now saw the lake as its pride, and me as its guardian. Sometimes, when I gave tours, I'd tell them, "This lake doesn't belong to me. It belongs to anyone who respects it." They'd smile, thinking it was just a nice line. But I meant every word. As summer deepened, I received a final letter, this one with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in familiar script. "You found it, didn't you? I knew you would. Maybe now you'll understand I wasn't just fighting you. I was fighting what I thought was forgotten. Thank you for proving me wrong. Take care of it, and yourself. K." I folded the note carefully and placed it next to Henry's letter in the safe. For the first time, I felt no anger toward Karen, only a kind of bittersweet closure. She'd finally let go. And so had I. The last scene I'll never forget came that fall, when the first frost dusted the pines and the lake reflected the sky like glass. I stood at the edge of the dock, Max at my side, watching mist curl across the surface. In that stillness, I could almost hear the echoes of everything that had happened, the fake cops, the shouting matches, the courtroom victories, the lonely nights of doubt. But those echoes didn't hurt anymore. They were just part of the story, like the ripples that fade back into calm. Earl joined me, his breath misting in the cold air. "You done fightin' the world yet?" he asked. I smiled. "Yeah. The world's finally on my side." He chuckled. "Took it long enough." We stood there a while, saying nothing more, just watching the water breathe. And as the morning sun broke through the fog, turning the lake into a sheet of gold, I realized something simple and absolute. Some battles aren't won by force, they're won by faith. Faith in your work. Faith in truth. Faith that even when others lie, cheat, or steal, what's real will endure. Clover Lake had tested every part of me, patience, pride, forgiveness, but it had also given me something I hadn't known I needed, redemption. Not from others, but from myself. When the breeze shifted and a single leaf fell onto the surface, spinning slowly before sinking, I whispered a quiet thank you, to the land, to the man who first dreamed it, and even to the woman who couldn't let it go. Because without all of them, there would be no lake. And without the lake, there would be no me.